Wait, hold up. You're about to scroll past this, aren't you? Well, what if I told you that historians have been wrong for over 2,000 years, and that Alexander the Great, yes, that Alexander, had plans that could have changed the entire course of Western civilization? And no, I'm not talking about some conspiracy theory or alternate history. I'm talking about actual historical documents that have been hiding in plain sight. Do you think you know the story of Alexander the Great? Think again. In the dusty vaults of a museum in Alexandria, Egypt, there lies a collection of papyrus scrolls that almost nobody has paid attention to until now. These scrolls contain something that rewrites everything we thought we knew about one of history's greatest military minds. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is going to blow your mind. And trust me, your history teacher definitely didn't cover this in class. Part 1. The Forgotten Scrolls. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in June 323 BC, at the young age of 32. At least that's what most history books will tell you. But here's where things get interesting. For centuries, historians have debated what Alexander was planning to do next. Was he going to invade Arabia? Was he going to consolidate his massive empire? Or did he have even grander ambitions? The truth, as it turns out, is far more fascinating than any of these theories. In 1887, a British archaeologist named Sir Flinders Petrie was conducting an excavation in the ancient city of Alexandria. While most of his colleagues were focused on the grand structures and monumental discoveries, Petrie had a peculiar interest in the mundane, the everyday artifacts that most would overlook. And it was this peculiar interest that led him to discover something extraordinary. In the back room of what appeared to be an ancient library, Petrie uncovered a sealed clay jar. Inside were several papyrus scrolls, remarkably well preserved due to the airtight seal of the jar. Now, here's where the story takes its first bizarre turn. Petrie couldn't read ancient Greek well enough to understand the scrolls, so he sent them back to England for translation. But, and I'm not making this up, the ship carrying these invaluable artifacts was caught in a storm in the Mediterranean and was forced to dock in Sicily for repairs. During this unexpected detour, the scrolls were misplaced. Yes, misplaced. Some of history's most important documents were literally lost in transit. For over 40 years, these scrolls were completely forgotten. They changed hands several times, most owners not even realizing what they had in their possession. They were cataloged as miscellaneous Greek texts and tucked away in the basement of a small museum in Palermo, Italy. It wasn't until 1931 that a Greek scholar named Andreas Papakonstantinou stumbled upon them during a routine inventory of the museum's collection. Papakonstantinou immediately recognized the significance of what he was looking at. These weren't just any Greek texts. They were military dispatches, bearing the seal of Alexander's royal court. But here's the kicker. The dates on these dispatches were from the weeks immediately preceding Alexander's death, and they detailed plans for a campaign that history had never recorded. Because, as it turns out, Alexander wasn't just planning to invade Arabia or consolidate his empire. He was planning something far more ambitious, a Western campaign that would have taken him through North Africa, across the Strait of Gibraltar, and into Europe. That's right, Alexander the Great had plans to conquer Rome, a rising power at the time, but nowhere near the empire it would later become, and then push northward into the lands we now know as France and Spain. Just let that sink in for a moment. If Alexander hadn't died when he did, the Rome we know from history might never have existed. The entire course of Western civilization could have been dramatically different. Now, I know what you're thinking. If these scrolls are so important, why haven't I heard about them before? And that's a fair question. The answer lies in the tumultuous years that followed Papakonstantinou's discovery. The 1930s and 40s were not exactly a stable time in European history, to put it mildly. With the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War II, academic discoveries, even groundbreaking ones, often took a backseat to more pressing concerns. Papakonstantinou published his findings in a small academic journal in 1932, but by then, the world had other things on its mind. His work was largely overlooked, and when he died in 1943 during the German occupation of Greece, his research died with him. The scrolls themselves were moved once again, this time to Athens for safekeeping, and once again they were catalogued incorrectly and forgotten. It wasn't until the early 2000s that they were rediscovered, this time by a team of researchers working on digitalizing the archives of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And what they found was even more incredible than Papa Constantinu had initially realized, because the scrolls didn't just outline Alexander's plans for a Western campaign. They included detailed maps, troop movements, supply lines, and even diplomatic strategies for dealing with the various tribes and city-states he would encounter along the way. This wasn't just a vague idea or an ambitious dream. This was a fully formed, meticulously planned military campaign, ready to be launched. And it revealed something else about Alexander that few historians had appreciated before: his remarkable understanding of naval warfare. Alexander is often remembered for his land battles, his innovative use of cavalry, his tactical genius at places like Issus and Gaugamela. But these scrolls showed that he had developed a sophisticated understanding of naval strategy as well. He planned to build a fleet of over 1,000 ships, dwarfing anything that existed in the Mediterranean at the time. He had detailed designs for new types of warships, specifically adapted for the rougher waters of the Western Mediterranean and Atlantic. But perhaps most fascinating of all were the diplomatic dispatches included in the collection. Alexander had already sent envoys to several tribes in what is now Spain and France, laying the groundwork for alliances that would facilitate his conquest. Some of these tribes had already responded positively, seeing an alliance with Alexander as an opportunity to gain an edge over their local rivals. In other words, the stage was already being set. The pieces were moving into place. Had Alexander lived just a few more years, the history of Europe, and indeed the world, might have unfolded very differently. But before we dive deeper into what these plans actually entailed, we need to address the elephant in the room. How do we know these scrolls are authentic? How can we be sure they're not elaborate forgeries? And that, my friends, is where our story takes yet another unexpected turn. Part 2, Authentication and Revelation. Let's talk authentication, shall we? Because I know what you're thinking. This sounds too incredible to be true. And you're right to be skeptical. In the world of archaeology and ancient history, forgeries are more common than you might think. From the famous Piltdown Man hoax to countless fake artifacts that have fooled experts, history is littered with elaborate deceptions. So what makes the Alexander scrolls different? For starters, the papyrus itself. When the scrolls were rediscovered in the early 2000s, they were subjected to a battery of tests that simply weren't available in Papa Constantinu's time. Carbon dating confirmed that the papyrus was indeed from the late 4th century BCE, exactly when Alexander was alive. But carbon dating alone isn't enough. Clever forgers have used ancient materials to create fake documents before. What's more compelling is the ink. Chemical analysis of the ink used in the scrolls revealed a composition that matches other documents from Alexander's court. This specific mixture of carbon, gum arabic, and other materials was distinctive to that time and place. But the most convincing evidence comes from something that forgers would find nearly impossible to fake: the linguistic patterns. You see, ancient Greek, like any language, evolved over time. The Greek of Alexander's era had specific dialectical features and idioms that would be different from, say, Greek a century earlier or later. Linguistic experts who examined the scrolls found that they contained subtle grammatical structures and vocabulary choices that were unique to the administrative Greek used in Alexander's court. These aren't things that would be obvious to even a highly educated forger. They're the kind of minute details that only modern computational linguistics can reliably identify. But there's another aspect that makes forgery extremely unlikely: the content itself. The plans outlined in the scrolls actually contradict what many historians had previously believed about Alexander's intentions. A forger typically creates documents that confirm existing theories or expectations, not ones that challenge them. Plus, some of the geographical details mentioned in the scrolls, specific coastal features of Spain and North Africa, for instance, weren't well documented in the historical record until much more recent archaeological work. A forger working in the 19th or early 20th century wouldn't have known to include these accurate details. All of this evidence together creates a compelling case for authenticity. These really do appear to be Alexander's last battle plans, preserved by chance and rediscovered through a series of fortunate coincidences. Now, let me tell you what's actually in these scrolls, because this is where things get really interesting. The centerpiece of Alexander's Western campaign was to be an unprecedented naval operation. He planned to move his army along the North African coast, using his fleet to supply them and to secure strategic ports along the way. The first major target was Carthage, a powerful maritime city that would later become Rome's greatest rival. Alexander's intelligence reports suggested that Carthage was wealthy but militarily unprepared for an attack from the east. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He would offer Carthage a choice between a generous alliance or complete destruction. Given Alexander's reputation for both magnanimity toward allies and ruthlessness toward those who resisted him, with Carthage's naval resources added to his own, Alexander would then push through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Iberian Peninsula. Here's where his diplomatic groundwork would pay off. Several Iberian tribes had already indicated their willingness to ally with him against their local rivals. He would exploit these divisions, just as he had done so effectively in Persia and India. But the most ambitious part of the plan was yet to come. After securing Iberia, Alexander intended to move northward into Gaul, modern France, and then, in a move that would have changed history forever, eastward toward Italy and Rome itself. Rome in 323 BCE was not yet the empire it would become. It was still a republic, primarily focused on consolidating its control over the Italian peninsula. It had yet to emerge as a Mediterranean power. Alexander's advisors estimated that Rome could field an army of perhaps 50,000 men, a substantial force, but no match for Alexander's veteran army of over 90,000, with its core of elite companion cavalry and the disciplined Macedonian phalanx. The scrolls include a fascinating assessment of Roman military capabilities, noting their discipline and organization but pointing out their inexperience against the kind of mobile, combined arms warfare that Alexander had perfected. In one particularly revealing passage, Alexander's chief military advisor, Eumenes, writes, "The Romans fight with courage but without imagination. They have never faced cavalry like ours, nor experienced the terror of our war elephants. They will break, as all others have broken before us." But Alexander wasn't just planning conquest for conquest's sake. The scrolls reveal something far more visionary. He was planning to create a truly unified Mediterranean world, with Alexandria in Egypt as its cultural and commercial center, and himself as its divine ruler. He had already begun the process of fusing Greek and Persian cultures in the East. Now he planned to bring the Western Mediterranean into this new cultural synthesis, and this is where we need to pause and consider the implications. Had Alexander lived to carry out these plans, the world as we know it would be unrecognizably different. Rome might never have risen to dominance. Christianity, which spread through the Roman Empire, might never have become a world religion. The political and cultural foundations of Western civilization might have been completely reshaped. It's one of history's great what-ifs, a tantalizing glimpse of an alternate timeline that never came to be. But the scrolls don't just tell us what might have been, they also give us new insights into Alexander himself, his thinking, his ambitions, and perhaps most interestingly, his state of mind in those final weeks before his untimely death. And that brings us to the most controversial aspect of these documents, because some scholars believe they contain clues suggesting that Alexander's death might not have been due to natural causes after all. But before we dive into that particular historical rabbit hole, let's take a closer look at the most fascinating tactical innovations outlined in these battle plans. Ideas so ahead of their time that they wouldn't be seen again in warfare for centuries to come. Part 3, the tactical genius revealed. Okay, let's get tactical, and I promise, even if you're not a military history buff, this is going to blow your mind. Because what Alexander was planning wasn't just ambitious in scale, it was revolutionary in execution. The scrolls reveal that Alexander had developed what modern military theorists would call combined arms warfare to a degree that wouldn't be seen again until, arguably, Napoleon's time some 2,000 years later. Let me break this down for you. Traditional warfare in Alexander's time was pretty straightforward. You had your infantry in the center, maybe some cavalry on the flanks, and you basically just marched forward and tried to outfight the other guy. But Alexander's Western campaign plans show something much more sophisticated. First, there's his integration of naval and land forces. The scrolls detail how his fleet would not just transport and supply the army, but would actively coordinate with it in battle. For coastal cities, he planned simultaneous attacks from both land and sea, with naval artillery providing covering fire for his assault troops. A tactic that wouldn't become common until the age of gunpowder, some 1,800 years later. Did you catch that? Alexander was planning naval artillery support for land operations. In 323 BCE, this guy was literally millennia ahead of his time. But it gets better. The scrolls also reveal Alexander's plans for a new type of unit, mounted archers trained to fight in the Persian style, but organized and disciplined according to Macedonian military principles. These would serve as a highly mobile strike force, able to harass enemy formations, disrupt their movements, and generally cause chaos before the main Macedonian phalanx engaged. It's a tactic that combines the best elements of Eastern and Western warfare, something that perfectly reflects Alexander's broader vision of cultural fusion. And speaking of the phalanx, Alexander had plans to modify even this, his army's traditional backbone. The typical Macedonian phalanx was armed with the sarissa, a pike about 18 feet long, and operated in a tight formation that was nearly impenetrable from the front but somewhat vulnerable on the flanks and rear. Alexander's new design called for smaller, more flexible phalanx units that could operate independently, with integrated light infantry to protect their flanks. This would give his army unprecedented tactical flexibility, allowing it to adapt to the varied terrain of Western Europe. But here's the real kicker. Alexander had designed a deployable field fortification system, essentially a portable fort, that could be quickly assembled by specialized engineering units. These prefabricated fortifications would allow his army to establish secure positions in hostile territory overnight, providing safe havens for supplies and wounded soldiers, and serving as bases for further operations. This is a concept that wouldn't become standard military practice until the Roman legions developed it decades later. And even they didn't have the sophisticated prefabrication system that Alexander had designed. Now, I want you to really appreciate how forward-thinking this was. We're talking about modular prefabricated military infrastructure. In the 4th century BCE, this is like finding out that someone in the Middle Ages had designed a prototype smartphone. It's that level of historical dissonance. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Alexander's plans was his logistical preparation. Ancient armies often struggled with supply issues, especially when operating far from home. Many campaigns were limited or even defeated not by enemy action, but by starvation, disease, and the simple challenge of keeping thousands of men fed and equipped. Alexander's solution was characteristically thorough. The scrolls detail a complex supply system involving pre-positioned stockpiles, agricultural settlements established specifically to support the campaign, and even a primitive form of rationing that allocated resources based on careful calculations of need. He had studied the agricultural cycles of North Africa, Iberia, and Gaul, planning his campaign route to coincide with harvest times in each region. He had even accounted for local cuisine and dietary customs, understanding that forcing his troops to suddenly adapt to unfamiliar foods could impact their health and fighting effectiveness. This level of detail, this degree of foresight, it's simply staggering. Even by modern military standards, the comprehensiveness of Alexander's planning is impressive. For the ancient world, it was unprecedented. But all of this raises an important question. If Alexander was so meticulous, so thorough in his planning, how did he fail to account for the one thing that would ultimately stop his grand Western campaign before it even began? His own mortality. And this is where our story takes its darkest turn. Because scattered throughout these tactical and logistical documents are personal notes and communications that suggest Alexander was increasingly concerned about threats from within his own court. Several messages refer obliquely to those who prefer the old ways and enemies who wear the masks of friends. In one particularly ominous note to his trusted general Ptolemy, Alexander writes, "Watch Antipater's men closely, especially those who prepare my food and wine." Antipater was Alexander's regent in Macedonia, and relations between them had grown increasingly strained. Many historians have speculated that Antipater might have arranged to have Alexander poisoned, though evidence has always been circumstantial at best. But these newly discovered writings add significant weight to the poisoning theory. They suggest that Alexander was actively concerned about assassination attempts in the weeks leading up to his death. One of the most chilling documents is a directive to his personal physician Philip, instructing him to test all remedies thoroughly before they pass my lips, for there are those who would use healing as a disguise for harm. When we combine these writings with what we know of Alexander's final illness, which included symptoms consistent with poisoning by strychnine or arsenic, the case for assassination becomes considerably stronger. So here we have the final tragic irony. The man who conquered most of the known world, who planned campaigns with meticulous attention to every detail, who seemed to have thought of everything, may have been undone by something as simple and mundane as poison in his wine. Alexander's grand vision for a Western campaign, for a unified Mediterranean world under his rule, died with him in that palace in Babylon. His empire fragmented, Rome rose to power, and history took the course with which we're all familiar. But these scrolls give us a tantalizing glimpse of what might have been, a road not taken, an alternate history that never unfolded. They also remind us of the fragility of even the grandest human endeavors, how the fate of empires and civilizations can turn on something as small as a cup of wine or a moment of illness. And in that reminder lies perhaps the most valuable lesson from this remarkable discovery. For all our planning, for all our ambition and vision, there remains an element of chance, of unpredictability, in human affairs that no amount of genius can fully overcome. Alexander was indeed a military genius with ambitious plans. We should still approach extraordinary claims with healthy skepticism. The real Alexander remains one of history's most fascinating figures, and the actual mystery of what he might have done had he lived longer is one of history's great unanswered questions. But that uncertainty, that space for wonder and speculation, is part of what makes history so endlessly fascinating. Thank you for coming on this journey with me, a journey through fact and fiction, through the actual achievements of Alexander the Great and the imagined plans that never came to be.